was substantial in Europe. Countries sort of got back on their feet and started progressing toward better things. I found this quote. This is supposed to be Napoleon on his horse with all of his men dying around him. But I found this quote and I had to share it with you. Most Americans are familiar with the ending of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, you know, which was commissioned. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Which was commissioned by Russia to celebrate Russia's defeat of Napoleon. The musical score ends with the sounds of cannons booming and bells pealing. However, if Tchaikovsky wanted to accurately record the sound of Napoleon's defeat, one would only hear the soft, quiet sound of lice munching on human flesh. Oh, it makes my heart soar like a hawk. Okay, remember the germ theory came around 1880, right? Shortly after that came what is known as the golden age of medical entomology. About a 20-year time window when some of the greatest discoveries in our field were made. And I just want to show you some of these heroes. Some of you may think this looks like 6 old men, which it is. But starting at the top left there, that's Dr. Carlos Finlay, who was a Scottish man educated in Baltimore. He went to medical school. And he worked in Cuba, and he hypothesized for more than 20 years that yellow fever was not transmitted by either contaminated objects or some miasma, some gaseous thing floating in the air that we breathe in. He said, no, it's the mosquito that does it. He started saying that in 1880, but he couldn't prove it. He never proved it. The guy in the top middle, he's considered the father of tropical medicine. He had an interesting theory. He thought that there's a disease called filariasis that is transmitted by mosquitoes. It's worms, and your legs swell up and other body parts too, by the way. And he thought you got it from drinking water that dead mosquitoes, that mosquitoes had died and dropped into the water. So people were thinking about these things. The guy in the top right was a French army physician. He was the first person to see human malaria parasites in human blood. Notice these are all physicians. There's not an entomologist among them. That part is coming later. Theobald Smith on the bottom left was a person of German extraction. He worked for our United States Department of Agriculture. He and a fellow named F.L. Kilbourne solved the mystery of a terrible disease that was ravaging cattle called Texas cattle fever. 1884. Showed conclusively, using Koch's postulates by the way, that the bacterium that causes it was transmitted by ticks. So people are starting to think about these things. Now the guy in the bottom middle there, he's an old Scot named David Bruce. And I don't think he's probably got more food stuck in that mustache than I've probably eaten in my whole life. How's that for a visual? He discovered a disease, a little old disease called sleeping sickness in Africa. And then finally on the bottom right, a British physician working for the British Army in India, Ronald Ross discovered that malaria parasites in birds were transmitted by mosquitoes, and then some Italians did the same thing for humans. So this all happened, as I said, from between about 1884 to just about 1901. That was the golden age of medical entomology. That's when we finally learned that these different types of insects and arthropods were transmitting things that were harming and killing animals and people. So then the question was, how are we going to get rid of these things? And the real thing that really topped this all off was when Walter Reed, who many of you have probably heard of, took a commission to Cuba and showed without question that the mosquito transmits the yellow fever virus and not all these other things. And then this fellow, another world-changing event, Dr. William Gorgas was a sanitary engineer, later the Surgeon General of the United States. He happened to be working with the Reed Commission in Cuba. And after the science was done, he organized an intensive mosquito control campaign, one of the very, very first ones, and it was run in a military style. And he went from house to house, he and his teams, and they burned sulfur inside the homes, and they put oil on all the water sources that they could find where the mosquitoes were breeding. And literally within a few short months, yellow fever was eliminated from Havana, where it had occurred every year for 400 years, by simple methods of mosquito control. And then where did Dr. Gorgas go? Does anybody know?
Panama Canal.
Who said that? Was that Jeff? 15 points for Ravensclaw, or whatever the really bad house was in Harry Potter, because that's where the sorting hat would have put you, my friend, just so you know. Slytherin, that's it. Yeah, I love it. He went to Panama, where the French had been trying to build the Panama Canal for years. If you want to read a great book, it's by David McCullough. It's called The Path Between the Seas. And it's all about the history of building the Panama Canal. And Teddy Roosevelt, our president at the time, listened to Dr. Gorgas and said, do it! And Gorgas cleaned up the Panama Canal from yellow fever and also malaria, and it became a reality, which changed world history. All right, so we had all this information. We knew about these disease cycles involving insects and arthropods. What we really didn't have was a lot of entomologists. Remember, those folks were all medical doctors. Nothing against medical doctors, my family's full of them. The real growth of entomologists in this country came about primarily due to World War II. Fighting in multiple theaters, people were dropping like flies from malaria and typhus and something called sandfly fever. And so in 1943, our government, our country had somewhere over 700 entomologists, either here or overseas, trying to figure these things out and protect the troops. And after World War II, a lot of them came back or needed jobs, and that's when a lot of insecticide development and other things started to happen. These are some of the diseases they dealt with. I mentioned a couple of them. That third one there is one of my favorite ones. It's Tsutsugamushi fever. Tsutsugamushi. Let's all say that together. Tsutsugamushi. You just said, yes, I'd very much like to spend the night in the trunk of your car. But we had a discipline problem. This is a great story. You recognize that drawing on the bottom right there? Who used to draw like that?
Dr. Seuss.
I heard it. Dr. Seuss. The soldiers wouldn't listen to their commanding officers, so some really smart person said, let's get Dr. Seuss to help us. He was fairly new in his career, but you know, Dr. Seuss says it's got to be true, right? So he put together a whole program about this nasty woman named Anne Opheles, who went out at night and her only cocktail was blood. And the malaria rates dropped like flies because Dr. Seuss said it. So it must be true. Bed bugs was obviously another big issue then. This is Douglas MacArthur, and the malaria was so bad. This is, ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Devlin. How you doing, Lynn?
What's up?
Nothing.
Happy people.
Okay, now, let's cut that interview, please. MacArthur said, Doctor, he said, this will be a long war if for every division I have facing the enemy, I must count on a second division in hospital with malaria and a third division convalescing from this debilitating disease. He really got it. Not malaria, he got the message. So the next big revolution was this little thing called integrated pest management. And I have a whole talk about IPM and whether we are actually walking the walk in IPM or just talking the talk. That's for another day. The picture in the top right there is kind of how the way we used to do it. That is a truck. I think it's on a beach, if I remember correctly. Looks like it is. And it's just driving down the beach, blasting everybody with a little old thing called DDT. That's what it is. That's what we used to do. That's not exactly integrated pest management. It's almost murder. What's that?
Great phrase.
You've heard me say that before, haven't you? Soak and hope, blow and go. Yeah, my daughter, who's 25, informed me one time that I probably shouldn't use those expressions because they mean other things, and I looked at it and said, what do you mean? Remember, I'm from Indiana. This is kind of what we've evolved to now, and this is actually, it says an IPM year there in the middle, and it's from the New York State Integrated Pest Management Program. Yeah, let's give it up for that, whatever it is. Is there actually such a thing, Len? Len, are you still alive? Okay. Anyway, I'm not going to read all those, but it shows all the components for integrated pest management that we think about. And here's just a few of them. As I said, after World War II, DDT came along, and then there was a whole line of synthetic insecticides, most of which we don't have anymore, unfortunately, I guess. But you would know their names. We now have a lot of what are called pyrethroids. Don't say synthetic pyrethroids, it's redundant. Synthetic pyrethroid means pyrethroid-like. So if you want to be really smart, you can say synthetic pyrethrum, but not synthetic pyrethroids. Just say pyrethroids and you got it. California put in this thing called, again, California, you know, fruits and nuts. Supervised insect control. We had a bunch of entomologists all of a sudden who needed to do stuff. They started doing things like, let's monitor the pests during the course of the year instead of just looking at the calendar and saying, well, it's June, it's time to go blast the fields with our insecticides. No, let's look at what the pests are doing before we start doing something like that. We started learning about their ecology. They're not all the same. As Bobby said, even the rats aren't all the same. These pests are the same type of deal. The toolbox expanded, obviously. We started looking at things like host plant resistance and changing the way we planted crops and things just based on how the pests were reacting. Cultural manipulations and multidisciplinary efforts, particularly among federal agencies, which I'll, believe it or not, they actually can work together successfully sometimes. I can say things like that. Remember, I was in the Navy for 23 years. And in 1970, this little old thing called the Environmental Protection Agency came along. They are not your enemies. Regulators are not our enemies. Nope. That's all I'm going to say on that. And you are allowed to hassle me because you've been through a lot of my classes, so you have permission, sir. In 1972, Richard Nixon actually said, I'm implementing integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, but I'm not a crook. And then in 1979, Jimmy Carter, God bless him, 97 now, is he? 96. Still hammer and nails, building houses. How we doing, Andy?
Beautiful.
Thank you. He created this thing called the Interagency IPM Committee, and it still is in existence, and they still meet regularly. So that was quite a change from just those two little pictures that you see there. And so most of you know these. Let's do pest management based on what the need is and not just to do it. I mean, I'm kind of simplifying it. You know, there's lots of really sort of sexy, long definitions of integrated pest management. I think of it as the rights. We use the right equipment with the right materials at the right time, in the right place, for the right pest, under the right conditions. That was 6, sometimes it's only 5. But that's kind of a good way to think of integrated pest management instead of, it's the use of all of our techniques in order to mitigate the pest. No, I don't like that. So it includes pesticides. I was at a meeting one time, and one of the people from the EPA stood up and said, now we're going to talk about integrated pest management, and then we'll discuss pesticides. And a bunch of us went, oh, wait a minute. Those two have to be discussed together. So it's part of it. We learn to think about what's an acceptable pest level, especially when you bring in the human factor. Some people will say, Mr. Pest Controller, you gotta come over right away. There's a cockroach in my
kitchen.
And they're calling you standing or texting you on a chair in the middle of the kitchen when you show up. And then there are other people, probably some of you have seen this, if you do bed bug jobs, and you go in and the bed bugs are everywhere. Guys asleep on the couch with bed bugs feeding on them. There's that human factor of what can you actually tolerate. Lowest possible cost, et cetera, minimal risk. You all know about that. I'm going to move ahead here so I can get to some of the later stuff. You know, when Andy comes in and gets behind the podium, it means one of two things, and I'm not going to discuss either one of them. Yeah, his fly was down, he said. Pest control flies. It happens. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about this. This is one of those interagency collaborations, and this may surprise you, but during and right after World War II, the Department of Defense and the USDA had a tremendous collaborative program on vector control, which produced some of the things that you might know about, one of them being the aerosol can. This was known as the aerosol bug bomb. That's one of the original ones. When I ran the Armed Forces Pest Management Board, we had a few of these in our display cabinet. But that's one of them, and that evolved into this. The aerosol can that we all know and love. And as it says, I'm not endorsing any products here. You know about ultra-low volume spray? That whole technology came out of USDA in the 1950s. This idea of putting out a cloud of tiny insecticide droplets that'll float through the air and anything that flies through there is dead. USDA working on behalf of the Department of Defense. Maybe you've heard of DEET, the active ingredient in most insect repellents, although now there's a whole bunch of other things you can use, and if you want to talk to me about that later, I'd be happy to. That became available to the military in 1944. You can see this happy GI here with his little bottle of DEET strapped in his headband there. A lot of people did not like it. The original formulations tend to do things like melt plastic, and since the GIs were given what we used to call BCGs, birth control glasses, because if you wear them, nobody gets within 20 feet of you. But the insect repellent would actually melt that plastic. The other thing, which was a little more tactical, was they thought the smell was so strong that the bad guys going past them when they were trying to hide might smell it and say, I smell that insect repellent, those Yankees are here. Guess we weren't known as Yankees then. And then the whole idea of repellent-treated clothing, which you can now buy online or in stores. That whole technology came from USDA in the late 1960s and early 70s and on.
Stan,
Yes?
the original aerosol cans highly pressurized and potentially explosive?
Yes, Jeff. That is true. Yeah, one of the early problems with the aerosol cans was they were a little too feisty and they would sometimes blow up, but you know, it's a minor thing.
That's the bug bomb.
That just keeps the troops occupied when they're in the field and they're bored.
That's why they call it a bug bomb.
Very minor.
So, what's the future look like in all this? I almost always try to show one of the figures from The Wizard of Oz in the talks, and sometimes it's the Scarecrow. I won't sing the Scarecrow song for you because we've already sang enough. But it's coming up here. Viruses, vectors, and victims can be anywhere in the world now in 24 hours. A person, what's your name, sir? Matt. Do you have a last name, Matt? No, you don't. Matt Novak. Matt did really, really good, and his company sends him to the Caribbean. His last day there, he's bitten by an infected Aedes aegypti mosquito that has chikungunya virus. If you want to have fun sometime, go through the drive-thru at Wendy's and order a chikungunya sandwich and see what they say. Jonathan, I need a new comedy writer. For the next 3 to 7 days, while he's back home, you live in Miami, by the way, and your yard's full of mosquitoes, you're a public health menace, by the way. But that chikungunya virus is multiplying in his blood to tremendous numbers, millions and millions and millions of virus particles. And he's not sick. That's called the incubation period. And he infects a whole bunch of mosquitoes in his backyard that then go around and start infecting people. That's exactly what happened in Florida in 2016 with Zika virus, when we had 224 local cases. So we can transport these things around. Insecticide resistance is a huge issue, especially when it comes to public health insecticides. Why? Because the market for public health insecticides is infinitesimal. That means really small, compared to the agriculture market. And so the companies that produce a lot of our public health insecticides, when something like re-registration comes around and they have to maybe fork out millions and millions of dollars, you know, we have all these new devices for detecting levels of things, and so the requirements, the regulatory requirements are getting stiffer and stiffer. They say, we can't afford to produce the public health stuff anymore, and we're seeing that happen. So our arsenal of insecticides for public health is shrinking. I put some letters up there, that's just to tell you that both the Department of Defense and a Gates partially